Damage over time, colloquially known as DoT in the gaming community. As the name suggests, it is any form of damage that is dealt to a target indirectly without any additional inputs or actions over a certain period of time. This is a mechanic that many a gamer is familiar with. If you played Pokemon, you've experienced it. If you played Minecraft, you've experienced it. If you played Genshin Impact, you've experienced it. DoT tends to come in many different forms. Some of the most common examples in gaming would be poison and burn, as they generally tend to deal a set amount of damage within a certain time frame. Wuthering Waves is no exception to this mechanic. There are debuffs that can be inflicted onto both the player and the enemies called negative status, and 3 of these inflict damage over time. Players already have a few characters that can inflict a couple of these negative statuses with their abilities, such as Chiakona for Arrow Erosion and Phoebe for Spectral Frazzle. Unfortunately, the damage from both Arrow Erosion and Spectral Frazzle is so negligible that there is not much of a point in using them outside of letting a different character do more damage or gain their meter faster. In version 2.8, there was a new 5-star character, Chisa, who had a focus on enhancing negative statuses. She was the first character to be able to inflict Havoc Bane, which would reduce the target's defense by 2%, stacking up to 3 times for a total of 6%. Not only that, she's able to temporarily increase the maximum amount of negative statuses that could be applied at one time by 3 stacks, bringing her Havoc's Bane defense shred up to 12%. This stacking effect also applies to the other negative statuses such as Arrow Erosion and Spectral Frazzle. And since both of these damages scale off the number of stacks currently applied, I had hopes that Chisa would be able to make a DoT team viable. So the moment I had Chisa raised to a decent level, I brought a DoT team consisting of her, Phoebe, and Chiakona into the middle tower just to see if I could clear it. And yes, while the DPS was consistent enough to clear the floor, it was nowhere enough to get a 3-star clear. And I get it. DoT, as the name suggests, is meant to deal damage over a much longer period of time. However, since a lot of endgame content is on a timer, it is pretty much the antithesis of DoT and for the most part, makes it so that DoT will never really work in its current state. An easy solution would just be to greatly increase the amount of damage dealt per DoT tick, but if that's the case, it'll just mean that DoT will become the brand new meta with teams consisting of both a DoT enabler and a DPS. That is not what I want. What I want is for the DoT-focused team to be a side grade to the current meta teams. Not a full upgrade, because a full upgrade would be the fastest way to have huge leaps in power creep. And the game already has a solid foundation to make damage over time work with the damage scaling with the number of stacks. Additionally, aside from Arrow Erosion and Spectral Frazzle, there is another DoT negative status called Electro Flare, which, according to the in-game description, deals periodic electro damage to the target and stacks up to 10 times. At the max stacks of Electro Flare, any new stacks inflicted become stackable Electro Rage, increasing the damage dealt by the next Electro Flare trigger. The higher the stacks, the higher the damage. But as of now, even going into the 2-year anniversary, we do not have a single character that can apply Electro Flare. And as it currently stands, the 2 other DoTs that the player has access to deal very little damage comparatively to just hitting the target with a big stick, and pretty much only acts as enablers for certain characters to access 100% of their kit. This doesn't mean that there aren't any other ways to let DoT work. It would just have to be tweaked a little bit, and I will not be making a video complaining about DoT not working without a few solutions. 3 of these solutions will be ideas from different games along with a 4th method, which would be my personal idea. Method 1. Poison Moth Flight and the Poison Flower Blooms Twice from Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, 2 of the most common DoTs are Poison and Scarlet Rot. There are others such as Destined Death and Deadly Poison, but Destined Death only belongs to one boss and a couple of mini-bosses, While I've seen deadly poison like twice in my hundreds of hours in Elden Ring, so I'll be focusing on poison and rot. Poison acts as it does in most games. Slow ticks of damage over a long period of time. Scarlet Rot is very much the same thing, except it does more damage per tick. Both deal a set percentage of the target's max HP plus a flat amount. Now, Scarlet Rot by itself is a very good dot due to the amount of damage it deals per tick, and one of my favorite ways of playing the game is to inflict both rot and poison onto an enemy. Then I'd fight the enemy as normal and reapply the two statuses when they run out, and usually by the time the second application of my super cancer runs out, the boss is either dead or very close to it unless I was playing like absolute garbage or incredibly passively. However, there is another way to let poison damage do its thing, and that is with the Ash of War or weapon skill / weapon art called Poison Moth Flight, which will remove the poison status from your target in exchange for a huge chunk of damage. And from what I've seen, the damage you inflict is roughly the same amount of damage that you would have done had you just let poison run its course naturally. For example, instead of letting poison inflict 500 damage over the course of 1 minute, you will deal that 500 damage with a single hit while also removing that poison status. However, this only applies to poison and not Scarlet Rot, and it is more efficient to use your limited FP with a better Ash of War, or just use magic. Then the DLC for the game Shadow of the Erdtree released, and with it came a new Ash of War called The Poison Flower Blooms Twice. This effectively did the same thing as Poison Moth Flight, except instead of only popping poison, it would pop both poison and Scarlet Rot. So, if say you gave a boss super cancer and then used TPFBT, good god that abbreviation, that will be a whole lot of damage at once. You're still honestly better off using a weapon art that doesn't need to rely on other effects and still does more damage, like Royal Knight's Resolve, which boosts the damage of your next attack by 80%, or an actual incantation or sorcery. Seriously, you'd be better off just casting Night Comet or Death Lightning Spear or anything else a bunch of times. Now, to bring this mechanic into Wuthering Waves, it'd be pretty much the same thing. As an example, let's say that this hypothetical character, who I'm just going to call Poison Moth for simplicity's sake, is in a team consisting of Phoebe for Spectral Frazzle and Shiokona for Aero Erosion, or Frazzle since she can do both. Both Phoebe and Shiokona would finish their rotations and apply their dots, then Poison Moth comes in, and maybe their resonance skill can increase the max duration of negative statuses on a target, or reset their timer back to full. After that, Poison Moth would use their Resonance Liberation, removing any negative statuses while also dealing damage, which would scale off both the amount of time remaining for the dots and the number of stacks. But what if you don't want to remove all the stacks so that the dots keep doing damage while you rotate back into Phoebe and Shiokona? Well, that's where Method 2 comes in. Back when I used to play Honkai Star Rail, one of my favorite teams to run was a DoT team focused around Kafka, Black Swan, a sustained character who at the time was Fu Xuan and then later became Aventurine, and the fourth team member would either be a buffer such as Ron Mei, or another DoT character such as Guinevere or Sampo, usually Sampo because he's my favorite character in that game. Before Kafka, however, and arguably before Black Swan, DoT was not a meaningful way of dealing damage. Generally, the most common way that a player would apply a DoT would be by breaking an enemy's toughness bar, which would apply a debuff on the target depending on the element of the damage that did the last hit. If the toughness meter was broken by either physical, fire, lightning, or wind, it would apply the dots Bleed, Burn, Shock, and Wind Shear respectively. There were characters that could regularly apply dots with their abilities. Sampo and Guinevere were able to consistently apply Wind Shear and Burn, but even at higher stacks of said dots, the damage was still pretty poor. And not only was the damage poor, dots would only do their damage when the target would take action. Unfortunately, since the meta for the primary endgame modes at the time, Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction, was focused on taking the least amount of turns as possible, and in turn meant letting the enemies take the least amount of actions as possible, dots were not even considered for clearing endgame content as a primary source of damage. And then Kafka released, and she pretty much revolutionized dot-focused teams. With both her skill and her ultimate, not only would she deal a decent amount of damage on her own, she would also take any and every dot currently applied to the target and trigger them. This was a major deal for dot teams as they no longer had to rely on the enemies taking action in order to deal damage, since Kafka could get that dot damage and trigger them not only on the enemy's turns but on her own turn. This is pretty similar to Elden Ring's Poison Mossflight and the Poison Flower Blooms twice. However, the difference is that both PMF and TPFBT would pop the dot and remove it entirely, while Kafka would only remove one turn's worth of dot, while dealing a certain percentage of what the original dot damage would have dealt. Her skill would inflict either 75% or 50% of the total dot damage, depending on who she was targeting, while her ultimate will deal 120% of the total dot damage. A mechanic like this could also work in Wuthering Waves. Instead of removing every single stack of the dot, such as arrow erosion, the Kafka equivalent could remove a set number of stacks of the dot, while also dealing that number of stacks worth of damage. For example, let's say a boss has 10 stacks of both Spectral Frazzle and arrow erosion. I know that arrow erosion can only go up to 6 stacks, but let's say in this case it can go up to 10. And with 10 stacks, both of the dots would deal 1000 damage over the course of the entire duration, so 2000 damage in total. The Wuthering Waves equivalent of Kafka could come in, use her skill, remove half the stacks of both SF and AE while dealing two separate numbers of 500, one for SF and one for AE, for a total of 1000 damage, on top of dealing damage with her actual attack. The ultimate could pretty much be the same thing, except instead of only removing half the number of dot stacks, it would refresh the number of stacks to the maximum of 10, pop both stacks for 1000 damage each for a total of 2000, maybe with an additional multiplier of 1.25 or something since it's an ultimate. This is pretty much a one-to-one recreation of Honkai Star Rail's Kafka, and I honestly think it would work pretty well, just like this next idea. Method 3. Venoshock from Pokemon. Venoshock is a move introduced in Generation 5 of the Pokemon games, aka Black and White. Venoshock is a special type poison move with 65 base power. It's pretty weak when compared to the likes of Sludge Wave, which has 95 base power, and weaker still compared to a move like Close Combat, which has 120 base power. However, Venoshock has a neat little gimmick. When used on a target that is already poisoned, the base power is doubled to 130. Poison is not so difficult to inflict onto opponents either, as normally I tend to have at least one Pokemon with the move Toxic and/or Toxic Spikes, which for those of you who may not be familiar with the move, Toxic Spikes is a setup move that can inflict either poison or toxic onto the opposing Pokemon when they swap in. Unless, of course, the opposing Pokemon is a flying type, a poison, or steel, the latter two would actually absorb Toxic Spikes, removing him, or has the ability Levitate, or is wearing the item Heavy Duty Boots, or has a move to clear hazards such as Defog or Rapid Spin. But that's neither here nor there. All that said, a mechanic like Venoshock could be implemented into Wuthering Waves. It could be a general purpose variant, such as if target has negative status, character's attack is doubled. Or the hypothetical character could do more damage if the negative status would match their elemental attribute. Like, say, a new electro character that does 2.5 times the damage against a target with Electro Flare, but if the target doesn't have Electro Flare but still has a different dot, this Venoshock character would only do twice the damage against the target. This could stack with other defensive shreds such as Havoc Bane, increasing the total damage dealt. But something like this could easily get out of hand if not handled with care. In the most recent Hazard Tower, my Amos hit for 472,000 damage with her ult. That number is already much higher than my second highest DPS character, so imagine if a new character came around and did 900k or 1 million damage in the tower so close to Amos's release. Okay, so update. In the time between me writing the initial script, which was during the previous TOA phase, and now, which was me clearing the latest tower and grabbing some B-roll, my Amos hit even harder for 656k at S0R1. This adds even more weight to my previous point with running the risk of having these huge leaps in power creep. To counteract this blatant power creep, this hypothetical Venoshock character's base attack can be lower than average. Instead of reaching an attack stat of roughly 2100 to 2400 like most DPS characters, this Venoshock character's attack stat can cap out around 1600 or something like that. If tier 0 meta characters are the equivalent of using 120 base power moves in Pokemon, such as Close Combat or Woodhammer, then this hypothetical character will be the equivalent of using the 65 base power move of Venoshock. This makes it so that only under specific situations that would require an initial setup would make this character either slightly stronger or equal in strength to the other top DPS characters. This also would not force a huge meta change, as it would primarily be a side grade. People who enjoy playing the current meta teams can keep playing their same teams and clear content just as quickly as they were before. It would actually be easier and more consistent to keep playing current meta teams, as the DPS output would depend entirely on you and your team buffs and your rotation. Just like how if you're going through a casual run of Pokemon, it's a lot easier to just spam powerful moves instead of relying on status moves. In this same regard, there will be many players who would think the same of this hypothetical Venoshock character. Why spend your hard-earned asteroids on a character that would only be a side grade to your current meta characters, while having a much more complicated rotation at that? Even so, this still is an idea that could work. And the funny thing is, this mechanic already exists in the game. Cardathia's passive, Wind's Indelible Imprint, lets her deal 30% more damage on enemies with 1 to 3 stacks of Arrow Erosion, with an additional 10% more damage for every stack of Arrow Erosion past the 3 up to a total of 6 stacks. She even increases the damage dealt by AE by 50% while increasing the interval between each tick by 50%. Aside from the transformation part, Cardathia is quite literally what this entire Venoshock character is about. Zani is another character whose damage depends on negative statuses, and no, I'm not talking about how quickly Frazzle will fill up her helical ember meter. No, what I'm talking about is the Echo Set effect of Eternal Radiance. Upon dealing Spectral Frazzle damage, Zani gains a 20% boost to her crit rate and deals 15% more damage to enemies with at least 10 stacks of Spectral Frazzle. However, Zani's DPS is completely throttled if you don't have Phoebe and has very little flexibility in terms of team setup or playstyle. So what if we went in the opposite direction, which leads us into the final method. Method 4, a new character that inflicts a new debuff that would increase the amount of damage dealt by DoTs. This is probably the most boring method out of the 4 mentioned because it is just a make number bigger situation. But the other good ideas were already taken by the aforementioned methods. This also happens to be what I originally thought Chisa would be, but sadly she was not. As of now, Chisa's primary use is to extend the duration and the stacks of Arrow Erosion so that Cardathia can deal more damage due to her passive. I already knew that DoTs weren't a consistent source of damage. Actually, no, that's wrong. DoT is a consistent source of damage, it just isn't a good source of damage. So when I learned that Chisa would increase the maximum number of DoT stacks that an enemy could take, I was hoping that each stack past the max amount would increase the damage of the DoT not linearly, but exponentially. For example, going by this chart on the wiki, Arrow Erosion deals a damage multiplier of 0.36 at 1 stack, 0.899 at 2 stacks, and every stack after that pretty much adds an additional 0.9 for a total of 4.497 at 6 stacks. But what if each stack past the third stack would be incremented exponentially? Instead of each stack getting increased by 0.9, what if the fourth stack will get an increase of roughly 1.5, then the fifth stack will be increased by 2.0, and then the sixth stack will be increased by 2.5. Now, rather than the sixth stack of arrow erosion having a damage multiplier of 4.497, it would have a multiplier of 7.5 or something. Of course, this sort of damage increase would only happen if this hypothetical DoT character was in the team and used their skill or ultimate to inflict a new debuff that would increase the DoT damage taken. Following the current trend of the WUMA numbers, the bonus DoT damage debuff could last for roughly 30 seconds so that the rest of the team can pop in and do damage during their rotations. So those are my 4 ideas in which a DoT-focused character could be implemented into the game. At the time of recording, there hasn't been a single Lahairoi character released or teased that seems to deal one of the DoT negative statuses. This honestly isn't that surprising, as negative statuses seem to be primarily a 2.x theme, specifically the Rina season characters, while Lahairoi seems to be focused more around Toon Break. But I am still holding out hope that there will be a DoT character in the future. Back in version 2.8, Kuro Games went out of their way to update Fusion Burst, Glacial Chaff, Electro Flare, and Havoc Bane to what they are now, so for them to have done that and then do nothing just seems a little odd. Amos even has a Resonance mode that gives her a buff if a teammate inflicts Fusion Burst onto a target. But at the time of recording, there isn't a single character in the game that can apply Fusion Burst. A DoT team doesn't even have to be tier 0. Honestly, tier 1 would be good enough for me. To bring up HSR again, back when the entire meta was revolving around Super Break and follow-up attacks, I was still using Kafka and Black Swan. Kafka was a full 7 patches old at that time, but I was still cruising along, doing just fine, clearing MOC and Pure Fiction without too much trouble. I remember reading posts from other members of the community talking about how difficult it was to deal damage without breaking the toughness meter on bosses, while I was just sitting there with Kafka not having to deal with the toughness meter as DoTs bypass that entirely. Just please, Kuro, give me a good DoT character. Anyway, that's all the talking points I wanted to get to. If you stayed this long listening to my ramblings about wanting a DoT character, thank you, I appreciate it, and I will see you all in the next video.
I can see the dawn on water's face, with the shimmering light that starts to race. Interwoven strokes that rise